The morning of June 6, 1944, was cold and gray. In the early light, the beaches of Normandy shook under the weight of the Allied invasion. Ships lined the horizon, and the sound of naval guns rolled inland like a storm. German troops waited behind concrete bunkers and barbed wire, knowing the enemy was coming in force. By mid-morning, American forces were pushing inland, leaving behind a trail of dead and wounded. In the chaos, medics scrambled to set up field hospitals just beyond the sand. A few miles inland, a row of green canvas tents stood in a muddy field. Inside, American medics worked with speed and precision. They had trained for months to handle this flood of casualties. Soldiers came in with shrapnel wounds, bullet holes, and burns. Many of these injuries in past wars would have meant death. Now, something new was at work. On a small table near the operating area, rows of glass vials held a golden-brown liquid. The label read, Penicillin. The discovery of penicillin was not new. Alexander Fleming had found it back in 1928, when he noticed a mold-killing bacteria in a petri dish. But making it in large amounts was another problem. For years, it was a laboratory curiosity. That changed when American and British scientists, backed by the U.S. government, developed deep tank fermentation to grow the mold in massive quantities. By 1943, factories were turning out millions of doses. Companies like Pfizer devoted entire production lines to it. For the first time, armies could treat infections on a large scale. Infections that once killed soldiers could now be stopped. American medics carried penicillin with them to the front. They injected it directly into wounds or gave it by syringe. The effect was dramatic. A soldier who might have died of gangrene now had a fighting chance. Limbs that would have been amputated could often be saved. The drug did not just treat disease. It kept men alive long enough to return to battle. Across the lines, the Germans relied on sulfa drugs. Sulfa had been a breakthrough in the 1930s, but it could not match penicillin's power. Sulfa slowed bacteria, but it did not destroy it. Deep wounds still turned septic, and soldiers still died. Germany's chemical industry, strained by years of war and Allied bombing, never built the capacity to make penicillin at scale. A few research groups tried, but by 1944 they were far behind. German field hospitals treated infections the same way they had in 1918. In the days after D-Day, German troops began capturing American prisoners. Some were wounded during the fighting. German medics examined them, noting their injuries. To their surprise, many of these men were healing in ways they had never seen. Deep lacerations were clean, with little pus or odor. Some had been shot through the leg or shoulder, yet the tissue was pink and healthy. When questioned, the Americans spoke of a new medicine. A few even pointed to the small bottles their medics carried. Word spread quickly among German doctors. In one captured aid station, a German surgeon held up a vial taken from an American medic's bag. He turned it over in his hand, reading the English label. He understood at once what it meant. This was the drug they had heard rumors about. It was not just another sulfa. This was something that could turn the tide of battlefield medicine. One German doctor, trained before the war, compared two patients side by side. One was a German soldier hit by mortar fragments. His leg was swollen, black at the edges, and stank of rot. The other was an American prisoner with a nearly identical wound. The American's leg looked clean. The difference was penicillin. The doctor realized there was nothing he could do to match it. His own supplies were limited to sulfa powders and crude antiseptics. For the first time, he felt helpless. In a nearby command post, officers discussed reports coming in from the field. Intelligence officers confirmed that the Americans were using penicillin widely. It was part of every medic's kit, from the beaches to the front lines. The realization hit hard. If the Americans could save more of their wounded, they could keep their fighting strength high. German units, by contrast, lost men not just to bullets but to infection. Every death or amputation weakened their already strained forces. A captured German medic later described the moment to Allied interrogators. He said that when he saw the effect of penicillin, he understood the broader picture. "We fight with rifles and tanks," he said, "but they fight with factories and science. We cannot match them." His words summed up a feeling spreading through the German ranks. It was not just the number of enemy troops or their weapons. It was the sense that the Allies were drawing on a different level of resources. Every healed wound was proof of that. As the summer battles raged across Normandy, the difference became clear. American soldiers wounded in the morning were sometimes back in the line within weeks. German soldiers, if they survived at all, might never fight again. The contrast showed up in casualty reports and replacement figures. German commanders could see their divisions shrinking, while the Americans seemed to stay steady. It was like watching a slow tide rise, knowing there was no way to stop it. In one field hospital near St. Lo, a German doctor stood in silence as he watched an American medic work. The medic moved calmly, cleaning a wound, injecting penicillin, and wrapping the leg in clean bandages. The doctor knew his own tools could not do the same. He thought of the factories back home, bombed and broken, and of the long supply lines that barely kept his units fed. He felt a hollow certainty form in his chest. This was more than a battle. It was a measure of two nations' capacities. In that moment, he understood that Germany's defeat was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. In 1928, a Scottish scientist named Alexander Fleming noticed something unusual in his laboratory. A dish of bacteria had been contaminated by a common mold. Around the mold, the bacteria had died. Fleming understood the mold was releasing a substance that could kill harmful microbes. He called it penicillin. At the time, he published his findings, but there was no way to make the substance in large amounts. It remained a scientific curiosity, interesting to researchers but of little use on a battlefield or in a hospital. For years, penicillin sat on the shelf as a promising idea. It was hard to grow the mold, and even harder to extract the active compound. Laboratories could produce tiny amounts, just enough for experiments. No one could imagine making gallons of it. The problem wasn't just scientific. It was industrial. The world had never seen a process for manufacturing a fragile, living product like this on a massive scale. As war approached in the late 1930s, interest in antibiotics grew. Scientists in Britain began to explore penicillin again, realizing it might save lives in the coming conflict. They faced a huge challenge. Britain was already preparing for war and lacked the factories to take on such a delicate and complex process. By 1941, British researchers had proof that penicillin could treat infections that once killed soldiers. The next step required the resources of a much larger partner. That partner was the United States. When the U.S. entered the war, the government and private companies joined forces to solve the production problem. Large pharmaceutical firms like Pfizer, Merck, and Squibb took up the task. They used deep tank fermentation, a method borrowed from brewing and food industries. Instead of shallow trays of mold, which produced only small amounts, they grew the mold in tall steel vats, carefully controlling temperature and nutrients. This allowed them to scale up production from laboratory flasks to entire factory floors. By 1943, the results were extraordinary. Penicillin, once measured in milligrams, was now measured in tons. Millions of doses rolled off production lines every month. American factories worked day and night, turning the mold into a weapon of war. The U.S. government prioritized penicillin, ensuring that every soldier could receive it if needed. What had started as an accident in a petri dish became one of the most advanced medical programs in history. Across the Atlantic, Germany faced a different reality. The German chemical industry was powerful before the war, known for dyes, explosives, and synthetic materials. But years of conflict, Allied bombing, and resource shortages crippled its ability to innovate. German scientists knew of penicillin, and some had even attempted small-scale production. Their efforts stalled because they lacked the specialized equipment and the time to experiment. By 1944, Germany had no system to make penicillin in large quantities. Instead, German doctors relied on sulfa drugs. Sulfa had been a breakthrough in the 1930s and was used widely in both civilian and military medicine. It worked by slowing bacterial growth, buying time for the body's immune system to fight infection. But it was not as powerful as penicillin. Deep wounds, especially from shrapnel or dirty battlefield injuries, often became infected despite sulfa treatment. Gangrene set in quickly. Amputations were common, and many soldiers died even after surgery. On the battlefield, the difference between the two drugs was stark. American medics carried small bottles of penicillin in their packs. When a soldier was wounded, they injected the drug directly into the wound or into the bloodstream. Within hours, the infection slowed or stopped. Soldiers who would have died from blood poisoning stabilized. Limbs were saved that would once have been cut off. Infections that had haunted every army since ancient times were now treatable. American field hospitals became centers of rapid recovery. A soldier wounded in the morning could be stabilized by evening. Clean wounds and steady vital signs meant a quicker return to duty. The morale effect was powerful. Troops knew that if they were hit, they had a strong chance of survival. Families back home received letters about recoveries that would have been impossible in previous wars. German medics treated similar wounds with sulfa powders and antiseptic washes. They worked hard, often under dangerous conditions, but they lacked the tools to fight serious infections. A leg wound might start clean, but within days the tissue would turn black and soft. The smell of decay filled the tents. Even with surgery, many patients did not make it. Those who survived often faced permanent disability. German soldiers feared wounds not just for the pain, but for the almost certain infection that followed. As the Allies pushed inland after D-Day, these differences became impossible to ignore. German doctors saw captured American soldiers with clean, healing wounds. They examined tissue that looked alive and healthy instead of rotten and swollen. They asked questions, and sometimes the Americans answered. When German medics saw the small penicillin bottles, they understood what was happening. The Americans had a weapon that worked at the microscopic level, one that saved men before they ever reached a hospital. The numbers told the same story. American casualty reports showed fewer deaths from infection and fewer amputations. German reports showed the opposite. Entire companies were lost not just to combat, but to illness and slow recovery. Each wounded soldier removed from the fight was another strain on Germany's shrinking manpower. Each recovered American soldier returning to duty was another sign of Allied strength. The gap widened as the summer of 1944 went on. Allied supply lines poured penicillin forward to every aid station. U.S. medics worked with confidence, knowing their treatments would hold. German doctors improvised, reused sulfa supplies, and sometimes operated without anesthesia or antibiotics at all. Even the most skilled German surgeon could not make up for the lack of medicine. Behind the lines, American factories kept running. Trains and trucks carried crates of penicillin across the ocean and into the combat zones. German intelligence reports noted the scale of this operation with growing alarm. The war was not just fought with rifles and tanks, but with glass vials and laboratory-grown mold. German officers realized that even if they fought bravely, they faced an enemy whose resources reached deep into science and industry. The difference between penicillin and sulfa was more than medical. It was a sign of which side had the means to win a modern war. The field hospital smelled of blood, smoke, and wet earth. Outside, the sound of artillery faded in and out with the wind. Inside, rows of cots were filled with men groaning through clenched teeth. A German medic bent over one of his own soldiers, peeling back a blood-soaked bandage from the man's thigh. The flesh was gray around the wound, and a foul odor filled the air. He sprinkled sulfa powder into the open tissue, his hands moving fast and practiced, but his face set in frustration. He knew what would come next. The wound was deep, and without something stronger, the infection would spread. In the next tent over, American medics worked on their own wounded. The battle outside was the same, the shrapnel just as sharp, the mud just as filthy. But the scene was different. A wounded American soldier lay on a table with a similar injury to the German. His leg was swollen and bleeding, but the tissue was still pink and alive. A medic wiped the wound clean and injected a clear fluid from a small glass vial into the soldier's muscle. The process was quick and precise. The medic did not need to speak. He had done it dozens of times before. Within hours, the swelling would begin to recede. By morning, the soldier would be stable. Back in the German tent, the man on the cot began to shake with fever. His breathing turned shallow, and his skin turned clammy. The medic called for a stretcher, but he already knew it was too late. Without surgery, the soldier would die by nightfall. Even with surgery, there was no guarantee. The doctors would likely cut off the leg, hoping to slow the infection, but gangrene might have already reached the bloodstream. The medic wiped his hands on a rag, his jaw tight. He had seen this same pattern hundreds of times since the war began. 2 men, 2 wounds, 2 outcomes. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the hedgerows, German officers gathered in a commandeered farmhouse. The day's reports were spread across a wooden table lit by a single lamp. Casualty lists grew longer with every passing hour. A captain read aloud the names of the dead, his voice flat and steady. When he finished, another officer placed a captured American field kit on the table. Inside were several glass vials, each carefully packed in cotton. The label read Penicillin. "This is what they are using," the officer said, holding one up for the others to see. The clear liquid glimmered in the lamplight. The room fell silent. They all understood its meaning. In the corner, a German medic cleared his throat. He had seen American prisoners earlier in the day, men with terrible wounds who were still alive and healing. "I treated one of our men this morning," he said quietly. "His wound was almost identical to one of theirs. Ours will not survive the week. Theirs will fight again." The captain turned the vial over in his hand. "We've heard rumors of this drug for months," he said. "Now we know it's real." He placed the vial back in the kit and looked at the others. "They are giving it to every soldier, even at the front. It is not rare anymore. It is standard issue." The implications settled over the room like a weight. They all knew what it meant in practical terms. A wounded American soldier no longer meant one less rifle in the fight. With penicillin, that man could return to duty in weeks, maybe even days. A wounded German soldier, by contrast, was often lost forever, either to death or permanent disability. "If they can return their men to battle while ours die in the mud," one officer whispered, "how do we fight that?" No one answered him. The discussion turned to numbers. The division's combat strength had dropped sharply over the past month. Whole companies were under strength, some down to half their original size. Replacements were scarce. Even minor skirmishes drained their manpower. Meanwhile, reports from intelligence units suggested that American divisions maintained their numbers despite heavy losses. The difference, the officers now realized, was not just recruitment or logistics. It was medicine. Interrogators had been questioning captured American soldiers for weeks. Most prisoners gave little information, but patterns emerged. Every medic carried penicillin. Every field hospital had crates of it. Some units even injected it preventively before operations. The Americans treated infection as another enemy to be defeated. It was a campaign fought with syringes instead of bullets, and they were winning it. One German doctor spoke of his frustration. "We work with what we have," he said. "But it is not enough. I amputate limbs every day. I pour sulfa into wounds and pray. Still they die." His voice was quiet but firm. "Our medicine belongs to the last war. Theirs belongs to the next one." The captain stared at the maps on the table. He saw the lines of Allied advance pushing inland from the beaches. Every mile they gained cost blood, but their strength never seemed to fade. Behind those lines, factories in America ran day and night, turning out not just tanks and planes but life-saving drugs. The captain thought of his own country's factories, bombed and broken, struggling to produce even basic supplies. A runner burst into the room with the latest casualty figures. The numbers were worse than anyone expected. The captain read them, then set the paper aside. "We cannot replace men at this rate," he said simply. No one disagreed. The room grew quiet again. Outside, the sounds of battle rolled on. Inside, the officers understood that they were fighting not only soldiers but an entire system of production and science that Germany could not match. Penicillin was just one piece of it, but its effects were visible every day in the field hospitals and on the front lines. The war was being decided not only by what happened on the battlefield, but by what happened under the bright lights of operating tents and in the sterile rooms of faraway factories. The captain closed the American field kit and pushed it aside. He rubbed his face with both hands, then looked at his men. "We are bleeding to death," he said. His words were plain and final. Outside, the night deepened, and the fighting went on. The rain fell steadily on the makeshift German camp. Soldiers huddled under torn tarps and the blackened remains of farmhouses. Their uniforms were soaked, their faces streaked with mud and fatigue. In a corner near the field hospital, a group of infantrymen sat smoking in silence. One of them stared at his bandaged arm, his expression dark. The wound was not healing. The smell of infection lingered in the air despite the sulfa powder sprinkled into it earlier. He knew what that meant. If the fever worsened, they would take him to the surgeons. After that, he might return without the arm or not at all. A few meters away, another group of soldiers whispered among themselves. They had seen captured Americans earlier in the day. The prisoners were badly wounded, some with injuries that should have been fatal. Yet they stood upright, walking with crutches, their wounds clean and pink. The Germans could not understand how it was possible. One soldier spat into the mud and cursed their own high command. He said Berlin wasted time on superweapons and propaganda while the enemy focused on saving lives. His voice carried anger and bitterness. Another soldier shook his head, saying nothing. For many, the sight of the healed Americans stirred feelings they could not easily name. Some felt awe, even respect, for the technology the enemy possessed. Others felt despair, a cold certainty that their own side had fallen behind. A few clung to hatred, blaming traitors or saboteurs rather than face the truth. But underneath it all was a growing dread. It did not matter how bravely they fought on the battlefield. Even victories felt hollow when every wound meant a likely death or amputation, while the enemy patched up their men and sent them back to fight again. At night, around small fires, the conversations turned bitter. One young soldier recalled his brother, who had died after a minor leg wound. The infection had spread fast, and the doctors had been powerless. His voice cracked as he spoke. Another man told of an American prisoner whose similar wound had healed so completely that he was already walking again. The contrast was too much to bear. Some cursed the Allies while others cursed their own leaders. Inside the hospital tent, German doctors worked under dim lantern light. The smell of antiseptic mixed with the smell of rotting flesh. The surgeons moved quickly, cutting away dead tissue, sprinkling sulfa, and stitching wounds closed. Their hands were steady, their skill undeniable. But skill alone could not fight bacteria. Time after time, they saw their work undone by infection. A young assistant carried a bucket of bloody bandages to the rear, his face pale and set. He did not speak. One senior doctor stood over a soldier whose leg was black and swollen. The man thrashed weakly, fever burning through him. The doctor knew there was no saving the limb. He reached for the saw and began the grim task of amputation. His movements were practiced, but his shoulders sagged with exhaustion. When it was over, he dropped the saw into a basin and rubbed his face. He had performed 3 amputations that day and knew 2 of those men would likely die anyway. Earlier, he had seen an American prisoner brought in for questioning. The man's wound was similar but clean, without the smell of decay. The tissue was healing. When the German doctor asked how this was possible, the prisoner mentioned penicillin. The word was unfamiliar at first, but the explanation became clear as others repeated it. It was a drug that killed infection outright. The American spoke calmly, even proudly, describing how every medic carried it, how every hospital had crates of it stacked in neat rows. The German doctor felt a sinking in his chest. He thought of the endless letters he had written to families, explaining deaths that he could not prevent. He thought of the countless limbs he had removed to slow infections that penicillin would have stopped in hours. That night, he sat alone on a wooden crate, staring at his hands. His assistant asked if he was all right. The doctor said only one thing: "We are fighting with knives and powders. They are fighting with science." Word spread through the ranks. Soldiers whispered about the drug that could save lives, about how the Americans had it and they did not. Rumors grew wild. Some claimed the Allies could even bring the dead back to life. Others said the drug came from secret factories buried deep underground. None of it mattered. The truth was clear enough. The Americans had something Germany lacked, and it was changing the war. One evening, a group of captured German medics sat together under guard. They spoke quietly, almost to themselves. One man, his face lined with exhaustion, described the first time he saw penicillin in action. He had been in Normandy when American wounded were brought in alongside German wounded. He remembered the difference as if it were yesterday. "Our men lay there, dying," he said, his voice low and even. "Theirs stood up and walked away. That was when I knew the war was lost." His words hung in the air. Even the guards said nothing. It was not a boast or an excuse. It was a simple statement of fact. The other medics nodded, each recalling their own moment of realization. Back in the German camp, morale continued to erode. Soldiers fought on because they had no choice, but the hope of victory faded. They watched as reinforcements dwindled and supplies grew thin. They saw their wounded carried away, never to return, while enemy prisoners healed and were exchanged. Some soldiers muttered that the war was cursed. Others blamed the leadership, claiming that Berlin cared more for rockets and grand speeches than for the lives of ordinary men. On the front lines, the disparity became a daily reality. Each time a soldier fell, his comrades wondered if they would ever see him again. Each time they captured an American, they saw the clean scars and healthy tissue that penicillin left behind. It was a constant reminder that they were fighting an enemy who seemed to have one foot in the future, while they were trapped in the past. The German doctor who had spoken earlier continued his work, though his spirit was broken. He no longer believed in victory. When he looked at a wound, he did not see just the injury. He saw the limits of his tools and the gap between what he could do and what the Americans could do. In private, he admitted to a fellow doctor that the war was already decided. Not by tanks or aircraft alone, but by the small glass vials he had once held in his hand, vials filled with a substance he could not make and could not match. The war in Normandy was brutal and unrelenting. Every day, columns of wounded moved from the front to aid stations and field hospitals. Trucks rolled past in both directions. Men going to fight and men coming back broken. For the Americans, the flow of wounded was heavy, but many of those men would heal and return to duty. In some cases, a soldier hit by shrapnel or a bullet in June was back on the line in July. This cycle kept their units strong. It gave commanders the ability to keep pushing forward without waiting for endless replacements from across the ocean. For Germany, the pattern was different. A soldier wounded in action was often lost for good. Some died in the field before reaching a hospital. Others survived transport only to face infection that spread faster than surgeons could cut. Limbs were amputated, but even then, the soldier rarely returned to combat. Those who lived often spent the rest of the war recovering or were discharged entirely. Every battle drained German strength in a way the Americans did not face. It was a slow bleed that no tactics could stop. As the weeks passed, the difference became clear in the numbers. In American units, casualty recovery rates were high. Commanders reported that more than half of their wounded were returning to service. In some divisions, the rate was even higher. German reports told another story. Recovery was slow, deaths were high, and the pool of available men kept shrinking. By late summer of 1944, entire companies were reduced to half their original size. Officers spoke openly of the shortage. They needed more men, but they also needed time, and they had neither. Penicillin made the gap wider. Every dose meant a man saved, a rifle back in the fight, a squad kept at full strength. American medics carried the drug forward to the edge of the battlefield. Even in the chaos of an attack, a wounded soldier received treatment within minutes. The infection never had a chance to take hold. In contrast, German medics worked with the tools of the last war. Sulfa powder slowed infection, but it did not stop it. By the time a German soldier reached surgery, his wound was often too far gone to save. The effect reached beyond the battlefield. In Berlin, senior officers studied reports coming in from Normandy and Italy. They saw that American divisions held their numbers despite heavy losses. The Germans were losing men twice over, first to enemy fire and then to disease. This reality shaped their decisions. It meant that even when German forces won a tactical victory, they lost strategically. A hill might be taken, a town defended, but the cost in irreplaceable manpower was always higher than what the Allies paid. The psychological blow was deep. German commanders prided themselves on discipline and skill. They had trained their troops to fight hard and maneuver well. But now, they faced an opponent whose strength seemed endless. It was not just about numbers. It was about a system that could repair its soldiers as easily as it repaired tanks or trucks. To many Germans, it felt as if they were fighting a machine, one fed by factories across the ocean. In private meetings, generals admitted what they could not say publicly. They were being outproduced and outpaced. American logistics reached far beyond Europe. Behind every frontline medic was a chain of laboratories, railways, and factories working in perfect coordination. Germany could not match it. Bombing raids had destroyed vital plants. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled workers had been sent to the army or killed in the cities. Even if they discovered penicillin tomorrow, they lacked the means to make enough to matter. At the front, this imbalance was visible every day. German units fought hard but grew thinner with each battle. American units took losses, then filled the gaps almost overnight. A map in a command post showed the difference. Red lines marked German strength, shrinking month by month. Blue lines marked American strength, holding steady or even growing. The contrast was undeniable. Some German officers still hoped that better tactics or new weapons could reverse the tide. They talked of armored counterattacks, secret rockets, or sudden breakthroughs. But others saw the truth more clearly. A war is not won by single battles alone. It is won by sustaining an army over years of fighting. Without men to hold the line, tanks and rockets meant little. By autumn, whispers spread through the ranks. Soldiers understood the reality even if they never saw the maps. They saw it in empty bunks, in the wounded who never came back, and in prisoners who healed while their own comrades died. Each clean scar on an American soldier was another sign of defeat. Penicillin was only one part of the Allied war machine, but it symbolized something larger. It showed how far the Americans had gone in combining science and industry with military power. German high command realized this too late. Even as they planned operations, they knew their enemy's advantage was not just at the front but deep in the factories and laboratories thousands of miles away. The war had become a contest of systems, and Germany's system was breaking apart while the American one grew stronger with every passing day. When the war ended, Europe lay in ruins. Cities were broken, bridges gone, and railways twisted like scrap wire. Millions were dead or wounded, and disease followed hunger through the rubble. In the first months of peace, medical teams worked to stop epidemics that often came after war. Penicillin moved quickly from the battlefield into these efforts. Crates of the drug arrived in ports and were rushed by truck and train to hospitals across the continent. It saved lives not from bullets now, but from pneumonia, meningitis, and infections that had once killed children and the elderly by the thousands. Germany, shattered by bombing and divided by occupation, saw penicillin arrive under Allied control. German doctors, many of whom had first seen the drug in enemy hands during the war, now used it themselves. In the hospitals of Berlin, Munich, and Hamburg, they treated civilians wounded by air raids or burned in fires. They saw children survive illnesses that would have taken them only a year before. The drug that had once symbolized defeat now became a tool of recovery. Factories that had produced weapons turned to making medical supplies. With Allied guidance, German pharmaceutical firms studied the methods perfected in the United States and Britain. They learned the process of deep tank fermentation, how to grow the mold in steel vats, how to filter and purify the final product. By the late 1940s, Germany was producing its own penicillin, no longer reliant on Allied shipments. What had been a weapon of war became part of civilian life, sold in pharmacies, prescribed in clinics, and taught in universities. Doctors who had worked through the war spoke often about the change. They remembered the years when a simple wound could turn fatal and when hospitals stank of gangrene and antiseptics. Now, with penicillin, wards were cleaner, operations safer, recoveries faster. A surgeon in Frankfurt wrote in 1947 that his amputation cases had dropped by half compared to the war years. Another doctor in Cologne recorded survival rates for pneumonia climbing every month as supplies increased. The public noticed too. Newspapers ran stories about children saved from infections that had once swept through schools and orphanages. Mothers wrote letters thanking doctors for lives spared. For a population exhausted by years of death, penicillin felt like proof that science could rebuild what war had destroyed. Historians looking back saw more than a medical breakthrough. They saw how science, industry, and war had collided in the 20th century. The story of penicillin was not just about Fleming's discovery in a London lab. It was about the factories in Brooklyn and Peoria that learned to make it by the ton, the soldiers who carried it in their packs, and the generals who saw its effect on casualty reports. It was about logistics and chemistry as much as about medicine. Some writers called it one of the silent weapons of the Second World War. It made no noise like artillery and left no craters like bombs, but it shaped the outcome all the same. By saving the wounded and returning them to combat, it kept Allied units strong through long campaigns in France, Italy, and the Pacific. Commanders could plan operations knowing their losses would not cripple them as in past wars. The psychological effect on both sides was immense. German officers after the war admitted this openly. In interviews and memoirs, they spoke of the moment they realized the Allies had not only more tanks and planes but also better medicine. One captured medic described seeing American soldiers with wounds that would have been fatal for his own men. He said that was when he knew the war could not be won. Military analysts later linked penicillin to a broader lesson about modern conflict. Wars were no longer decided only by tactics or courage. They were decided by production lines, research laboratories, and the ability to turn discoveries into practical tools quickly and on a massive scale. Penicillin showed what happened when governments, scientists, and industry worked together with a single goal. By the 1950s, the drug was everywhere. Pharmacies in Europe and America sold it cheaply. Doctors prescribed it for infections that had once filled graveyards. Other antibiotics followed, each building on the success of the first. But penicillin kept its place in history. It was the bridge between the old world of medicine, where infection ruled every battlefield and hospital ward, and the new world, where science could tip the balance not only of health but of war itself.